In a large, bustling city where skyscrapers touched the clouds and streets buzzed with life, there lived a man named Marcus Holloway. He wasn't just any man, he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, one of the most powerful positions in the country. But what made Marcus truly special wasn't his title or his fancy robes, it was his heart. Born into a modest family in a neighborhood often overlooked by those in power, Marcus had worked tirelessly to rise above his circumstances. His journey wasn't easy. He faced countless obstacles because of the color of his skin, but he never gave up. Through hard work, determination, and an unshakable belief in fairness, Marcus became a beacon of hope for millions of people who felt forgotten by the system. Marcus's courtroom was known for being a place where truth mattered more than money or influence. Whether it was a wealthy businessman accused of fraud or a struggling single mother fighting for custody of her child, everyone received a fair hearing under Marcus's watchful eye. People admired him not only for his sharp legal mind, but also for his compassion. He had a way of making even the toughest cases seem manageable, offering solutions that balanced justice with humanity. Outside the courtroom, Marcus spent much of his time speaking out against injustices. He didn't shy away from addressing uncomfortable topics like racial inequality, corruption, and police misconduct. While some praised him for his courage, others resented him deeply, especially members of law enforcement who felt threatened by his calls for reform. On this particular evening, Marcus found himself standing behind a podium at a prestigious university, delivering a speech to a packed auditorium. The event was part of a series called Voices of Change, and Marcus had been invited to share his thoughts on creating a more equitable society. As he spoke, his voice carried both passion and authority. "Justice," he said, pausing to let the words sink in, "is not something we can take for granted. It must be fought for every single day." He went on to talk about the importance of holding institutions accountable, urging young people in the audience to challenge the status quo and demand better from their leaders. The crowd listened intently, hanging on to every word. Some nodded in agreement while others scribbled notes in their journals. When Marcus finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Students lined up to shake his hand and ask questions, eager to learn from someone they saw as a role model. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to feel proud, not just of his accomplishments, but of the impact he was having on the next generation. But as the night wore on and the crowd dispersed, reality began to creep back in. Stepping out of the university building, Marcus felt the cool air brush against his face. The streets were quieter now, the usual chaos of the city replaced by a calm stillness. He walked toward his car, parked a few blocks away, reflecting on the evening's events. Little did he know, however, that this peaceful moment would soon be shattered. As Marcus drove home, his mind wandered to the challenges ahead. Reforming a broken system wasn't going to be easy, especially when so many people benefited from keeping things the way they were. He thought about the resistance he'd faced over the years, the threats, the insults, the attempts to silence him. Yet, none of that had stopped him before, and it wouldn't stop him now. Determination burned within him, fueling his resolve to keep pushing forward no matter what. Unbeknownst to Marcus, danger lurked just around the corner. In the distance, two figures sat inside a police cruiser, their eyes scanning the darkened streets. They weren't ordinary officers. They belonged to a division infamous for its aggressive tactics and questionable ethics. These men prided themselves on maintaining control, regardless of the cost, and tonight fate had placed them directly in Marcus's path. What happened next would change Marcus's life forever, testing everything he believed in and forcing him to confront the harsh realities of the world he sought to improve. Though he couldn't see it yet, the road ahead was about to become far darker and far more perilous than anything he had ever imagined. As Marcus drove through the quiet streets of the city, the rhythmic hum of his car's engine was the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. The university was far behind him now, its grand buildings swallowed by the darkness. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the pavement. Marcus felt a sense of calm, a rare moment of peace after a long day filled with speeches, handshakes, and deep conversations about justice and reform. His mind drifted to thoughts of home, where his wife would likely be waiting up for him with a warm cup of tea, ready to hear all about the evening's events. But just as Marcus began to relax, he noticed something unusual in his rearview mirror. Two bright lights appeared in the distance, growing larger and brighter with each passing second. At first he assumed it was another vehicle simply driving too close, but then the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights illuminated the interior of his car. His heart skipped a beat. He glanced at the speedometer. His car was well within the legal limit. Confused, Marcus slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, parking beneath the faint glow of a street lamp. The police cruiser came to a stop directly behind him, its headlights glaring into Marcus's rear window. For a moment nothing happened. The world seemed to freeze as Marcus sat gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why had they stopped him? Had he unknowingly committed some minor infraction? Or was this something else entirely? His mind raced, with questions, but he forced himself to stay calm. After all, he was Chief Justice Marcus Holloway, a respected figure who had dedicated his life to upholding the law. Surely there must be a reasonable explanation for this. Finally, two officers stepped out of the cruiser. They moved slowly, deliberately, their boots clicking against the asphalt. One of them approached the driver's side of Marcus's car, while the other lingered near the front of the vehicle, his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. Marcus rolled down his window, the cool night air rushing in. "Good evening, officers," he said politely, his voice steady despite the unease building inside him. "Is there a problem?" Instead of responding immediately, the officer leaned forward, peering into the car with an expression that made Marcus's stomach churn. It wasn't curiosity or professionalism. It was something colder, more calculating. "License and registration, please," the officer demanded, his tone clipped and devoid of warmth. There was no hint of courtesy in his words, only authority laced with suspicion. Marcus nodded, doing his best to remain composed. He reached for his wallet and retrieved his driver's license, then leaned over to grab the registration from the glove compartment. As he handed the documents to the officer, he decided to clarify the situation. "I'm not sure why I was pulled over," he explained calmly. "I believe I was following all traffic laws." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step back, studying the license and registration under the dim light of his flashlight. Then, without warning, he turned to his partner and muttered something Marcus couldn't quite catch. Whatever it was, it caused the second officer to smirk. A chill ran down Marcus's spine. Something about their demeanor felt off. Almost predatory. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus asked cautiously, hoping to diffuse the tension. He knew full well that revealing his identity might come across as arrogant, but he also believed it was necessary to explain the absurdity of the situation. Before the officer could answer, however, the second cop walked over and leaned down to peer into the car. His eyes narrowed as he studied Marcus's face. "You're telling me you don't know why we stopped you?" The second officer sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe because you fit the description of someone we've been looking for." Marcus frowned, confusion washing over him. "What description?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "I haven't done anything wrong." The first officer finally spoke again, but instead of offering clarification, his tone grew even harsher. "We'll decide what's wrong here, sir. Now keep your hands where we can see them and step out of the vehicle." At this point, alarm bells were ringing in Marcus's head. This wasn't how routine traffic stops were supposed to go. He had seen enough cases in court to recognize when procedures were being ignored. Yet, despite his rising anxiety, he complied. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out onto the curb. The cold night air bit at his skin as he raised his hand slightly, signaling cooperation. "What's going on here?" Marcus asked, his voice firmer now. "If there's been a misunderstanding, I'd like to clear it up." But the officers weren't interested in explanations. They exchanged another glance before one of them barked, "Turn around and place your hands on the hood of the car." Marcus hesitated for a split second, searching for any sign of reason in their faces. Finding none, he reluctantly obeyed, pressing his palms against the cool metal of his car's hood. The next few moments felt surreal. One officer began patting him down roughly, his movements aggressive and unnecessary. "You carrying anything illegal tonight?" the officer growled, his breath hot against Marcus's ear. "Because if you are, this is going to get real messy for you." "I'm not carrying anything," Marcus replied firmly, struggling to keep his composure. "And I think you need to tell me exactly what's going on." His words fell on deaf ears. Meanwhile, the second officer rummaged through Marcus's car, tossing items aside carelessly. Papers fluttered to the ground, and the contents of the glove compartment spilled onto the passenger seat. Marcus watched helplessly as the scene unfolded, his mind racing. Was this really happening? Could these men not see who he was? Did they not understand the implications of detaining someone in his position? "Hey," Marcus called out, his frustration boiling over. "This is unacceptable behavior. I'm Chief Justice Marcus Holloway." For a brief moment, silence hung in the air. Then, laughter erupted, from both officers. It was a cruel, mocking laugh that sent a wave of humiliation crashing over Marcus. "Oh yeah?" the first officer sneered, leaning closer. "Well, congratulations, Your Honor, you're under arrest." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Arrested? For what? He hadn't broken any laws. He hadn't resisted. He had done everything they asked. And yet here he was, standing on the side of the road, treated like a common criminal. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. As the officers tightened handcuffs around his wrists, Marcus realized something chilling. This wasn't about justice. It never had been. This was about power, the kind of unchecked power that thrived in the shadows of fear and prejudice. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Holloway understood what it truly meant to be powerless. The handcuffs bit into Marcus's wrists as the officers yanked him toward the squad car, their grip firm and unyielding. Each step felt heavier than the last, not just because of the physical restraints, but because of the weight of what was happening. The night air, once cool and calming, now seemed suffocating. Passers-by had begun to gather along the sidewalk, drawn by the commotion. Some stared in stunned silence, while others pulled out their phones to capture the surreal scene unfolding before them. Flashlights from the officers' cruisers cast harsh beams across Marcus's face, making him feel exposed, vulnerable, like an animal caught in a spotlight. "Hey, what's going on here?" one bystander shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. "Why are you arresting him?" Marcus wanted to answer, to explain who he was and why this entire situation was absurd, but the words caught in his throat. His mind raced, searching for a way to make sense of it all. These officers weren't interested in explanations or fairness. They were determined to assert dominance, no matter how unjustified. As he stood there, surrounded by flashing lights and murmuring voices, Marcus realized that pleading his case would only fall on deaf ears. Still, he couldn't stay silent. "I'm Chief Justice Marcus Holloway," he called out again, louder this time, hoping someone, anyone, would listen. "This is wrong. I haven't done anything." His declaration was met with laughter, cruel and dismissive. One of the officers leaned in close, his breath hot against Marcus's ear. "You think your fancy title means something out here?" He sneered. "Tonight you're just another suspect." The words stung more than the cold metal around his wrists. Marcus had spent years fighting for justice, standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves, yet here he was, defenseless, humiliated, and treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. He glanced at the growing crowd, searching for a sympathetic face, but most people looked uneasy, unsure of whether to intervene or simply watch. A few whispered among themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief, while others filmed the encounter, their phone screens glowing faintly in the darkness. As the second officer continued to rifle through Marcus's car, tossing items onto the ground without care, Marcus felt a surge of anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You have no right to do this," he protested, his voice rising despite the tightness in his chest. "I demand to speak to someone higher up." But the officers ignored him, acting as though his protests didn't exist. Instead, they exchanged smirks, clearly enjoying the power they wielded over him. "Demand all you want," one of them said mockingly. "It won't change a thing." By now the crowd had grown larger and a few brave souls stepped closer, trying to get a better look at what was happening. A young woman holding her phone steady spoke up, her voice trembling but defiant. "Sir, can you tell us why he's being arrested? He hasn't done anything wrong." Her question hung in the air, unanswered. The officers didn't even acknowledge her, focusing instead on shoving Marcus into the backseat of the squad car. The door slammed shut behind him, sealing him inside the cramped space. The interior smelled of stale air and old leather, and the metal bars dividing the front seat from the back served as a grim reminder of where he was and what was happening to him. Through the window, Marcus could see the crowd continuing to grow. More people joined, some shouting questions, others filming silently. The flashing lights of the police cruiser reflected off their faces, illuminating expressions of shock, anger, and confusion. Despite the chaos outside, the inside of the car felt eerily quiet, save for the sound of Marcus's own breathing. He clenched his fists, the cuffs digging deeper into his skin, and tried to steady himself. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had always believed in the system, in the idea that truth and justice would prevail. But now, sitting in the back of a squad car, he wasn't so sure anymore. The officers climbed into the front seats, slamming their doors shut. One of them turned to glare at Marcus through the rearview mirror. "You better hope we don't find anything incriminating in your car," he said, his tone laced with menace. "Because if we do, you'll regret ever opening your mouth." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry. He knew there was nothing incriminating in his car, just papers, pens, and a spare jacket, but the threat lingered, gnawing at his nerves. What if they planted something? What if they twisted the truth to justify their actions? The thought sent a chill down his spine. For the first time in his life, Marcus understood the fear that countless others had faced when confronted by those sworn to protect and serve. It wasn't just fear of arrest, it was fear of being stripped of dignity, of having your humanity disregarded entirely. As the squad car pulled away from the curb, leaving the crowd behind, Marcus pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window. Lights blurred past as they drove through the city streets, each turn taking him further away from the life he knew. His mind raced with questions. Where were they taking him? Would anyone believe his story? And most importantly, how could this happen in a country that claimed to value freedom and equality? Despite his efforts to remain calm, a wave of despair washed over him. He thought about his family, his wife, Evelyn, and their 2 children. They would be worried sick when he didn't come home. Would they even know where he was? Would they understand what had happened? The thought of them seeing him like this, handcuffed, humiliated, treated like a criminal, was almost too much to bear. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, but Marcus blinked them away. He refused to let these men see him break. Instead, he focused on the faces of the people he had sworn to serve, the ones who looked to him for guidance and hope. He reminded himself of the speeches he had given, the reforms he had championed, the lives he had touched. If he survived this ordeal, he vowed to fight harder than ever before, not just for himself, but for everyone who had endured similar injustices. For now, though, Marcus was trapped, powerless, and alone. The squad car sped through the empty streets, its siren wailing like a harbinger of doom. Every second felt like an eternity, every mile a step closer to the unknown. Marcus closed his eyes, trying to block out the noise and focus on staying strong. But deep down, he knew that this moment would leave scars that no amount of resilience could fully heal. The squad car came to a screeching halt in front of the precinct, its tires squealing against the asphalt. Marcus's heart sank as he looked out the window at the imposing brick building bathed in harsh fluorescent lights. It was a place he had visited countless times before, not as a suspect, but as Chief Justice presiding over cases and delivering verdicts that shaped lives. Now he was on the other side of the law, a prisoner in his own city. The irony wasn't lost on him, but there was no time to dwell on it. The officers opened the door roughly, pulling him out with an unnecessary force that made his shoulders ache. As they led him inside, Marcus felt every eye in the room turn toward him. Officers lounged behind desks or stood chatting by the coffee machine, their conversations pausing as they took in the sight of the handcuffed man being escorted through the station. Some smirked, others whispered among themselves, and a few simply stared, their expressions unreadable. Marcus tried to keep his head high, though the weight of their judgment pressed down on him like a leaden blanket. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, to remind them who he was. But what good would it do? They had already decided what kind of man they believed he was. "Name?" barked a gruff voice from behind a cluttered desk. Marcus turned to see a burly officer sitting slouched in his chair, chewing gum loudly as he flipped through paperwork. His uniform was wrinkled, and his cap sat crookedly on his head, giving him an air of indifference. "Marcus Holloway." Marcus replied evenly, meeting the man's gaze. "Chief Justice Marcus Holloway." The officer paused mid-chew, raising an eyebrow as if assessing whether this was some sort of joke. Then, without missing a beat, he scribbled something onto a clipboard and slid it across the counter. "Sign here," he said curtly, pointing to a line at the bottom of the form. Marcus glanced at the document, his frustration mounting. "I'm not signing anything until you tell me why I'm here," he insisted, his voice firm despite the circumstances. "You can't just arrest someone without cause." The officer leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face. "Oh, we've got plenty of cause," he drawled. "Now sign the paper or things are gonna get a whole lot worse for you." Marcus clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath the surface. He knew refusing wouldn't help. He was outnumbered and powerless. But the sheer injustice of the situation burned within him. Reluctantly, he grabbed the pen and scrawled his signature, each stroke feeling like a betrayal of everything he stood for. As soon as he finished, the officer snatched the clipboard away and handed it off to another officer nearby, who began typing furiously into a computer. Next came the fingerprinting process. Marcus was led to a small, sterile room where a technician waited, latex gloves covering her hands. She didn't speak as she rolled his fingers one by one onto an ink pad, then pressed them firmly onto a sheet of white paper. The cold, clinical nature of the act only added to Marcus's humiliation. Each print felt like a mark of shame, branding him as guilty before any evidence had been presented, or even fabricated. When the fingerprints were done, Marcus was instructed to stand against a wall for a mugshot. The bright flash of the camera blinded him momentarily, freezing the moment, forever in pixels. The image captured more than just his face. It captured the exhaustion, the fear, and the indignation etched into his features. For someone who had spent years ensuring fairness in the judicial system, having his likeness recorded in such a degrading manner was unbearable. Finally, his personal belongings were confiscated. His wallet, keys, phone, and even the watch he'd worn every day since becoming Chief Justice. One by one, they disappeared into a plastic bag labeled with his name, sealed shut, and placed on a shelf alongside dozens of others. Watching his possessions vanish left Marcus feeling stripped bare, as though even the smallest reminders of his identity had been taken from him. With all formalities completed, Marcus was ushered into a holding cell deep within the precinct. The clang of the metal door shutting behind him echoed through the narrow hallway, sending a shiver down his spine. Inside, the space was cramped and dimly lit, with concrete walls stained by years of neglect. A single bench ran along one side, its surface scratched and worn from countless occupants. The air smelled faintly of sweat and mildew, making it hard to breathe. For a moment, Marcus simply stood there, taking in his surroundings. This wasn't how justice worked. At least, it wasn't supposed to. People weren't supposed to be arrested without reason, humiliated publicly, and thrown into cages without due process. Yet here he was, living proof that the system he had fought so hard to reform was still broken, and deeply flawed. As the reality of his situation settled, Marcus lowered himself onto the bench, wincing as the cold seeped through his clothes. His mind raced, replaying the events of the night over and over again. How could this have happened? Why hadn't anyone intervened? And most importantly, when would someone realize the mistake and set him free? Minutes stretched into hours, marked only by the distant hum of activity outside the cell. Occasionally, footsteps echoed down the hallway, accompanied by muffled voices or the jangle of keys. But no one came to check on him. No one offered explanations or apologies. Marcus was alone, trapped in a limbo between freedom and imprisonment, with nothing but his thoughts to keep him company. Despite the bleakness of his predicament, Marcus refused to give in to despair entirely. He thought about the people counting on him, his family, his colleagues, the millions who looked to him as a symbol of hope. If he survived this ordeal, he vowed to fight harder than ever before. He would expose the cracks in the system, shine a light on the injustices hidden in plain sight, and ensure that no one else endured what he was going through tonight. But for now, Marcus could do little more than wait. The minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly, each one stretching longer than the last. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the wall, and tried to focus on staying strong. Somewhere beyond these walls, the world continued spinning, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding within. All Marcus could do was hold on, to his dignity, his resolve, and the faint hope that justice might eventually find its way to him. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Marcus sat motionless on the cold bench inside the holding cell, his body stiff and aching from the uncomfortable position. The dim light above flickered occasionally, casting eerie shadows across the grimy walls. Every sound, the distant echo of footsteps, the metallic clang of doors opening and closing, the muffled voices of officers talking, felt amplified in the silence of his confinement. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, as though it had lost all meaning. Marcus glanced at the clock mounted high on the wall outside his cell, its hands barely moving. It was almost cruel, how slowly they ticked. His mind wandered back to the events that had brought him here. He replayed every detail of the traffic stop, searching for something. Anything. He might have done differently. Had he been too assertive? Too calm? Should he have remained silent instead of trying to explain himself? The questions swirled, endlessly, but no matter how many times he revisited the scene, the outcome always remained the same: handcuffs, humiliation, and this cold, unforgiving cell. As the minutes passed, Marcus began to notice the other inmates more clearly. There were 3 men in the adjoining cells, their faces obscured by shadow but their presence undeniable. They whispered among themselves, their voices low and wary. Occasionally, one would glance in Marcus's direction, sizing him up before turning away. At first, Marcus tried to ignore them, focusing instead on steadying his breathing and keeping his thoughts organized. But curiosity eventually got the better of him. Who were these men? What had landed them here? And did they recognize him? One of the men finally broke the unspoken barrier between them. "Hey," he called out, his voice raspy and cautious. "You're not from around here, are you?" Marcus hesitated, unsure whether responding was wise. But isolation was starting to weigh heavily on him, and even a brief conversation felt like a lifeline. "No," he replied softly, leaning forward slightly so his voice carried through the bars. "I'm not used to this." The man chuckled, dryly, a humorless sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "None of us are used to this," he said bitterly, "but some of us end up here more often than others." He paused, studying Marcus with narrowed eyes. "What did you do?" Marcus opened his mouth to answer, then stopped himself. How could he explain that he hadn't done anything, that he was Chief Justice Marcus Holloway, a man who had spent his life fighting for fairness and equality? Would they believe him? Worse yet, would they mock him like the officers had? Instead, he settled for a vague response. "I don't think I did anything," he admitted quietly. It's complicated. The man let out another hollow laugh. Ain't that the truth? He muttered. Then, after a moment of silence, he added, They say justice is blind, but she ain't blind enough if you ask me. The comment struck a nerve, sending a pang of guilt coursing through Marcus. Here he was, a symbol of justice locked away in a cell alongside those he had vowed to protect. And yet, he couldn't deny the truth in the man's words. Justice wasn't blind. It was biased, shaped by prejudice and privilege. Those with power and influence often walked free, while those without bore the brunt of the system's failures. Marcus had seen it happen countless times in courtrooms across the country, but now, experiencing it firsthand, he understood it in a way he never had before. Another inmate chimed in, his voice gruff and impatient. Don't waste your breath talking to him, he snapped at the first man. He's probably just another suit trying to play victim. The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because Marcus knew exactly what the man meant. To them, he looked like someone who belonged to the world outside, the world of authority, rules, and consequences. Someone who represented the very system that had failed them. I'm not playing victim, Marcus said firmly, surprising even himself with the edge in his tone. I'm telling you, I didn't do anything wrong. The second man snorted derisively. Yeah, sure, that's what they all say. His sarcasm was thick, dripping with resentment. Tell me, Mr. Innocent, why are you wearing cuffs and sitting in a cell right now? Marcus didn't respond immediately. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but what could he say? The truth, that he was Chief Justice Marcus Holloway, would sound absurd in this context. Even if they believed him, would it change anything? Would it make them see him as an ally rather than an outsider? Or would it only deepen the divide between them? Instead of answering, Marcus turned his gaze downward, focusing on the cracked floor beneath his feet. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. For a long time, none of the men spoke, leaving Marcus alone once again with his thoughts. He thought about the people relying on him, his family, his colleagues, the millions who saw him as a beacon of hope. What would they think if they could see him now, sitting in a dingy cell, powerless and humiliated? Would they understand? Would they forgive him for failing to prevent this moment? Time continued to crawl, each hour blending into the next. By now, exhaustion was setting in, both physically and emotionally. Marcus's body ached from sitting in the same position for so long, and his mind felt foggy, overwhelmed by the weight of everything that had happened. Sleep seemed impossible, yet the lure of unconsciousness was tempting. If he could just close his eyes and drift away, even for a few moments, maybe he could escape the suffocating reality of his situation. But sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, images of the arrest flashed in his mind. The flashing lights, the mocking laughter, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his skin. Each memory brought fresh waves of anger, frustration, and fear. How could this be happening? How could a system he had dedicated his life to reforming turn against him so completely? Just when Marcus thought he couldn't endure another minute, a commotion erupted outside the cell block. Voices rose sharply, followed by the hurried clatter of footsteps. The noise grew louder, drawing closer until it reached a crescendo just beyond the door. Marcus strained to hear what was being said, catching snippets of urgent conversation. Something was happening, something big. Moments later, the door swung open, revealing two officers flanked by a third figure, a tall, bespectacled man in a sharp suit. Marcus recognized him instantly. It was Detective Harris, a seasoned investigator known for his integrity and commitment to fairness. Harris scanned the room quickly, his eyes landing on Marcus. Recognition dawned on his face, followed by a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Chief Justice Holloway?" Harris asked, stepping forward. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of urgency beneath his words. "What in God's name are you doing here?" Marcus exhaled sharply, relief flooding through him despite the lingering bitterness of the ordeal. Finally, someone who understood the gravity of the situation. "Detective Harris," he said, rising to his feet. "Thank goodness you're here. I need help. I've been arrested and I don't know why. Harris frowned deeply, glancing at the officers accompanying him. This is unacceptable, he muttered, shaking his head. Turning back to Marcus, he added, We'll get this sorted out immediately. You shouldn't have been detained like this. For the first time since the arrest, Marcus allowed himself to feel a sliver of hope. Maybe this nightmare was finally coming to an end. But even as Harris gestured for the officers to unlock the cell, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the damage had already been done. No matter how this played out, he knew he would carry the scars of this experience for the rest of his life.